Good morning. I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm the Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia Journalism School devoted to enriching reporting on the aftermath of violence and tragedy of all sorts around the world. We are the co-sponsors of today's workshop, along with the Thomas Scattergood Foundation. In a few minutes, Joe Pyle from Scattergood will say a few things. The DART Center exists because we believe that as journalists, we need resources, background, sources, knowledge in order to effectively report on people who experience, whether as individuals or communities, the most difficult events and the most difficult disruptions that life has to offer, whether that is the intimate sphere of intimate partner violence, individual street crime, or the great cataclysms of war and disaster and human rights. We both help journalists do a better job of reporting on those stories, of interviewing, narrating the lives of individuals, families, communities, and also looking sometimes at the impact of these difficult assignments on us as journalists. We're primarily today dealing with the former, primarily looking at a very important story and asking how do we report it better. This is the fourth in a series of workshops here in Philadelphia sponsored by the Scattergood Foundation, designed to strengthen the capacity primarily of journalists in the Philadelphia region. And I know most of you here and a few others who will be coming a little bit later in the day are from this area. And we'll go around in a few minutes, introduce one another. Let me now just frame today's workshop to talk about why we're doing it. Then I'll do a little bit of housekeeping and kind of an overview, and then we'll move on with the day. We didn't plan it this way, but we are here gathered this weekend at a really highly polarized, highly charged, politically charged moment of debate over immigration and immigrants. It's not just a debate about policy. It's a debate about people and the experiences they bring and where those experiences fit into the American story as well as into their own stories. And highly polarized moments like this challenge our toolkit as journalists in unique ways. For one thing, we know all of you here are in one way or another on the immigration beat, and we know that this story is too big and too complex to be left to the politicians, and yet that's what's driving the story. It also challenges, I think, two important parts of our framework as journalists. One is that very often we think that our job when big stories present themselves is to simplify them for news consumers, to make things digestible and so on. Yet at a time when of polarized political debate, issues are being oversimplified, are being cast into black and white terms, our job becomes a little bit different. Our responsibility becomes to insist on complexity, to insist on the richness of individual and family and community experience, to insist on the complexity of challenges that migration and immigration, that adaptation and aspiration all bring, and the complexity of experiences. This is also a moment when the way in which we usually think of our work in terms of beats, subjects, all collide and get mushed up. It's a time when law, politics, mental health, neighborhood and community issues all are implicated in covering immigration and all get mushed up together, our job becomes to disaggregate them a little bit. This is the broad mandate of these workshops we do with the Scattergood Foundation is to look at the mental health related impact of trauma related issues, and immigration fits into that framework, and yet you can't talk about psychological health issues, behavioral health issues, and immigration without also talking about politics. You can't talk about policy being debated in Washington without looking at the particular experiences of displacement and trauma that people bring with them as individuals, as families, as groups. You can't look at particular groups without looking at the diversity of experiences within those groups. So over the course of the next 2 days, we're going to tease out some of those issues. I also want to talk about this idea of trauma. Some of the workshops that we do have a very sort of narrow focus. We did one here last year on covering suicide, and that's a very specific kind of violence and a very specific story. Here we're talking about something a little broader. You don't want to generalize and assume that all immigration stories are all trauma stories. And yet sooner or later it is true that all immigrants are somewhere on a spectrum of loss and resilience. That all immigrants, even the most successful and voluntary, are dealing with loss and separation, are dealing with historic displacement and challenges to adaptation. And at the far end of the spectrum, as many of you in this room know probably better than I do, people are bringing very challenging and complicated histories of immediate violence, whether it's fleeing Syria or coming up through the violent Underground Railroad up through Latin America, or any of the other great sweeping violent experiences that people bring with them, whether it's experience of exploitation and trafficking, or whether it's encountering bigotry or outright violence here in the United States. So we are on the ground of very complex trauma when we're talking about immigration and immigration policy and immigration politics. And that, in turn, goes back to our core toolkit as journalists. So much of what we do as reporters involves reporting on people who have a lot of power, and our toolkit is very well suited to that. Any of you in this room, I could put in a press conference with President Obama or with a corporate head, and you would know what to do. The experience, as many of you know, of reporting on people who have been disempowered by history or who are starting at a very low place on the social status scale and end up sometimes even lower, requires a different toolkit, different kinds of interviewing, different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of presumptions. We'll address some of those craft issues over the next couple of days. I also think that as Americans, as American journalists, we are also prey to our own national mythology. And our own national mythology includes liking the success story, liking the aspirational immigration story. That's important, and that's part of it. But so too is the experience of sometimes failure, or being unable to cope in the short run, or facing family challenges, personal challenges that are overwhelming. Here in Philadelphia, there are many immigrant communities that face these challenges. There are a variety of agencies, some of which are on the program today, some of which will meet tonight, that deal with both sides of that, and we don't want to lose sight of that. Carl Sandburg once said that Nelson Algren once said about the city of Chicago that its great motto is, "I will," but what if the answer is, "But I can't"? As journalists, we need to be engaging with both the I will aspirational story of immigration and the what if I can't story of people who, in the short run, see themselves as not having options, as victimized, or as in a very challenging place. That's got to be part of our story today. Finally, I think this workshop is about giving ourselves not only new sources, and that's important, new information and language, that's important, but new eyes and ears as reporters. The other night, the Dart Center sponsored a talk in New York by a former Philadelphia Inquirer reporter, actually, named Gaitra Bahadur, who has written a brilliant new book. She's a great-granddaughter of an indentured plantation worker who emigrated from India to Guyana. Gaitra herself immigrated from Guyana to the United States as a child. And in the course of this conversation, she said, and I know I'm going to get the quote wrong, but she talked about the immigrant child, being an immigrant child, and she said that the journalist and the immigrant child actually have a lot in common. We've got nothing but questions. We're always asking questions. And I hope that this workshop over the next couple of days gives us a chance to ask new questions in new ways and have more questions than answers. Finally, and I think I'll sort of close the intro this way. I would be wrong to not note that we're here on the day after the death of Nelson Mandela. And I think that is, Mandela's story matters to us in this room and matters when talking about immigration because Mandela spoke to the idea of social transformation. At the time Mandela was jailed, and for so many years afterward, South Africa seemed locked in an immovable and polarized state, even more extreme, obviously, than our own current debate about immigration. Yet we tend to assume that these states, these issues, are locked in stone and locked in place. Mandela, I think, represents both the long march, the long, patient time it takes to see change and make it happen. And we as journalists play a role in that, but also represents the rapidity of change when it does come. And I think that as journalists here in Philadelphia and in other parts of the country, you are now shaping a moment when change, whether it's this year or next year, is going to come with startling rapidity. The world has become a much more global and fast-moving place. The nature of immigration to the U.S. and sometimes from the U.S. has changed. And a lot of what the politicians are taking for granted as the defining terms for discussing the issue at this moment are, I think, going to change. Mandela reminds us that both patience and change are part of the equation. Let me talk a little bit about the workshop structure. Today is primarily expert-driven. We have a great morning keynote. We have several other folks through the day who are going to walk us through mental health issues, community issues, politics issues, and others. Tomorrow is primarily devoted to journalist discussion, craft discussion. How do we take all of this new knowledge and make interviewing, narrative, image out of it that is effective and meaningful? This is a structure that's worked pretty well. There'll be a bridge moment this evening. There'll be a little reception and a speed networking session when community groups from the Philadelphia area that work in the immigration space are all here. And we'll sort of have a little exercise to get all of you to get to know them so that the next time you're doing stories, your palette of sources is greatly increased. This has worked very well on other issues, and I think it'll be even more exciting on this one. I'll have a little more housekeeping in a few minutes, but now I want to first of all acknowledge and thank the Thomas Scattergood Foundation for Behavioral Health and Joe Pyle, its president, because he's why we're here. The Scattergood Foundation, as I said, has supported these local workshops in Philadelphia for several years and has developed, after some initial skepticism, I think, a deep commitment to journalists and journalism and to helping the public understand the story of some of the most vulnerable people in this region in a different way. I'd like to introduce Joe Pyle, who will say a few things, and then we'll get back to business. Sir. So, microphone for purposes of video.
So you're sounding more and more like Chris Satullo, calling me skeptical about the role of journalism. So I will be really brief, because I think following Bruce's comments, there's not a whole lot that I really feel like I need to add, but I guess a couple things. So I'd like you to think about your role for the next 2 days. And I think, as Bruce so well put it, you've got a great 2 days in front of you. And I'd like you to think about it during the course of the day as you hear different speakers, you look at the material that you'll receive, the colleagues you'll be in the room with. What can you take away from this? I know myself, I always look to what can I take out of these presentations. The other piece is that I think you have something to offer the speakers that will be here, and as journalists. And I'd like you to think about that relationship in the question and answer. I think that you have a very powerful role in the community, and I think the academics and the practitioners and the organization, the providers of service that you'll hear from can really benefit from your lens and your wisdom. So I would hope that you're not only a receiver of information in these next 2 days, but also kind of giving it back that way. And I guess the last thing that I would say is important to us as a foundation is, how do you anticipate that you might use this over the upcoming year and years? And I think Bruce and I were having just a little sidebar about our journey in this funding of journalism. And it really did come out of a meeting on black men and boys that was held up at Columbia probably now about 6 or 7 years ago, where I attended, and on the way back from New York realized that mental health did not have the kind of focus on how to cover these issues, how to have journalists do no harm on the reporting of mental health issues. So that's really what began the conversation with then Arlene Morgan, Associate Dean, and Bruce about, could we build a program here in Philadelphia. They were doing some of it at the Carter Center already, but we really wanted to bring it to Philadelphia locally. And it also led us, as many of you may know, we fund Mike and Scott, the behavioral health reporter here at HYY, and have a good relationship with her. And I think her reach has been growing, and I think that that's been good. And actually, I would be remiss to thank HYY for supporting us in this space, but also today they launch a new health show that'll air on WHYY radio at both 9 o'clock on Fridays and on 10 o'clock on Sundays. And it will be about grassroots health reporting. So you might want to all look into that and how you might connect to that. It's called The Pulse. So again, I just want to thank you for all being here, and I'll turn it back over to Bruce.
Hearing about the new HYY show makes me want to say that this is a conversation, among other things, in the next couple of days, about innovation. When we talk about innovation in journalism these days, we mostly are talking about, tweeting and technology and stuff like that. And by the way, I'll have some tweeting information for you. But my own view is that reporting on an issue like immigration, reporting on communities of disrupted and displaced folks, requires innovative approaches in reporting, innovative interviewing, innovative storytelling, and an innovative background news agenda. So this is, in fact, and innovation event.